Hello students, welcome to medical school and welcome to this Introduction to the History of Medicine course. This is the course that recounts the fascinating story of how medicine has evolved over the centuries from the prehistoric era to modern times. Welcome. I am Dr. Rafael Valenzuela, your course coordinator, and together with my co-faculty will be handling your lectures. I am trained as an eye surgeon and my co-faculty members are likewise trained in various medical specialties. But we share a common interest in the history of medicine, tracing how it evolved over time. And we would like to share insights and learnings about the profession in this course. And I hope you will find this to be one of the most unique, intellectually stimulating, and perhaps most enjoyable course you will have in medical school. And I will not lie, medical school is a challenging proposition. And this is what a medical student might look like after 4 years of training. But if your mind is made up and you persevere, then the end goal is worth it, I assure you. Now, every year we have a group of new students who come to class, and some of their comments are, "What? There's a history of medicine course in med school? But history was my most boring subject, and we already have too much on our plate. We already have anatomy, physiology, biochemistry. Why add more to what we have to study? Because it's mostly useless trivia and random facts, all useless memory work. And how is learning about people who died hundreds of years ago relevant to me now? And perhaps those who make history need not read about it." Many of us have brains that look like this already. We're already storing up so much information and we're receiving so much stimuli, whether from social media or other sources. And then we're asked to cram even more information into our brains in medical school. So many have likened medical school to sipping from a hose until we are overwhelmed because there's so much information. There's so much to learn, and it becomes even more complex the more that the body of knowledge is added to. And as a medical student, all you can do is gulp and gulp and try to remember as much as you can. So it's important to pace yourself because pacing yourself is the key to not being overwhelmed in medical school. Speaking in general, medical school is more focused on the process of becoming a doctor. By process, I mean it teaches you how to do things. So you learn about the human body, you learn its anatomy, you will learn how the body functions according to physiological and biochemical principles. You learn how to interview patients, how to recognize diseases, how to read EKGs and medical tests, and perhaps learn therapeutic and surgical procedures. So it's mostly focused on how you do things. But not all the time is the question asked, why do we do these things? And this is where the history of medicine comes in. It's the topic that asks, why do we do the things we do in medicine? Some say it's valuable to learn about the past because past events and ways of doing things and traditions can resurface again in the future. In this thing I found online, a patient might come to a doctor in 2000 BC with an earache. And "Doctor, I have an earache," and the doctor will say, "Here, eat this root." 1,000 years later, the doctor might say, "No, say a prayer instead." And then hundreds of years later, he might say, "No, that prayer is superstitious. Here, drink this potion." 1940s, "The potion is snake oil. Take this pill instead." And then later on, "The pill is ineffective. Take this antibiotic." And in present day, the antibiotic is artificial. "Here, take this root instead." So past ways of thinking can resurface in our time. Another practical reason for learning the history of medicine, the reason why we do things this way rather than just how to do them, is because of the current era we live in. Like it or not, people are more questioning and skeptical than they were in past years. Anybody now with internet access and a search engine can go online and in a matter of hours become a so-called expert in a number of fields. And we saw this during the pandemic. Government institutions and health experts who had years of experience were trying to counsel the public on how to conduct ourselves during this time. And this was based on historical lessons learned from previous pandemics, on tested protocols. But, of course, people would rise up and challenge them. Laymen and doctors would question why we are doing things this way. And that's not a bad thing. To ask the right questions can actually bring about great advancements in science. But that is the great strength and frustration of science. It is not written in stone. It is subject to change depending on new knowledge and on new data accumulated. So the approach to problems like the pandemic, for example, is based on course corrections and recalibrations made as new data arises. So it's very frustrating. And unless you communicate well with your patient, the patient now can question you and ask, "Doctor, why should I follow your advice?" It will not suffice to say, "Oh, because this is what I learned in medical school." Now you must justify your answer, explaining why you should do this, because people don't like to follow unless they understand what's going on. And perhaps if you're more cognizant of the history behind the treatment that you're recommending, then you'll be able to communicate more effectively with your patients. So lessons from the past can help us navigate and define the future, according to Confucius. Now, it's true that the history of medicine, as well as other medical humanities subjects, are not given as much emphasis in some medical schools. And this is perhaps because we are not dealing with hard science subjects. Science subjects are usually forward-looking and progressive, whereas the humanities are more introspective and inward-looking. But I would argue that the humanities deals with the education of a physician and in imparting qualities which are vital to becoming a good doctor. Qualities that are non-cognitive, but including compassion, ethics, intellectual curiosity, and empathy. Now I was reading this article from the British Medical Journal. The author is the Dean of a medical school in the UK, and he was lamenting that many medical humanities subjects, including the history of medicine, were removed from the curriculum. And he laments this because the graduates of his medical school, he believes, are just mere technicians now, lacking the important qualities that a true physician must have. He said that the history of medicine attracts some of the brightest minds in science, and it has prevented grave mistakes from recurring. And the history of medicine is a fascinating subject if it is taught well. And there is the problem that everybody can teach the history of medicine well, because it requires perhaps some general knowledge of history and society at large. And that's why history of medicine is hardly taught at all, or if it is, it's taught in a very detached, dry manner, which has no appeal for the average medical student. So, if I have not yet convinced you why studying history of medicine will be to your benefit, here are 7 reasons that I found online why studying medical history will make you a better doctor. Let's go over them. 1. Teaches healthy skepticism, because some of the disease concepts and management we learn now will be overturned with time. And this is true. Some of the knowledge you learn now in medical school will become obsolete, maybe even during your lifetimes. So maybe it's best to maintain an attitude of open-mindedness so we'll not be too shocked or overwhelmed when changes come to what we have held as truth for the longest time. Maybe you can learn from the example or perhaps the mistake of Galen. Who was Galen? Galen was actually a Roman physician. He was considered Rome's greatest physician. He was a genius. He made great discoveries in anatomy, physiology, and the healing arts. And he wrote down his findings. He had many writings and documents that were preserved over time and studied for centuries in the medical schools of Europe and the East. Generation upon generation of medical students studied Galen, like they studied the Bible. But then over time, mistakes were found out. And the problem is, no one dared question these mistakes because, as Galen had written down in his imprimatur, he said, "Everything I've written down is true, and nobody can dare question it." And because of this attitude, people who tried to correct Galen's findings found themselves silenced or cancelled by the establishment. It was only when the mistakes became impossible to deny as the centuries went by that Galen slowly lost his position as the greatest Roman physician. And nowadays he's considered more of the dunce or the bobo because the close-mindedness that he promoted retarded medical progress for 1300 years. So we learn it is best to keep an attitude of open-mindedness to change. Now I ask you, what good is it to study medicine if it will not benefit society in general? Studying history can show us what can go wrong in the field of medicine and how this can also negatively impact society. Let's take the case of Germany. Germany is now considered one of the most progressive and democratic countries in the world. It is the homeland of geniuses like Beethoven and Mozart. It produced great literary figures like Franz Kafka, Thomas Mann, and Goethe. And it also produced great scientists like Albert Einstein. But not too long ago, it also gave birth to this individual who preached a religion of authoritarianism and anti-intellectualism, which resulted in the destruction of much knowledge. And it also corrupted people who would otherwise be pledged to serve the human race. Here are Nazi doctors performing experiments on helpless victims, and these are now considered crimes against humanity. This is how medicine can become corrupted by ideology. And although the fascistic reign of the Nazis ended with World War II, sadly, many of the philosophies are still very much alive in our time and can infect any country. History can also teach us needed lessons in humility, something that I admit doctors have to be reminded of occasionally, because even the most talented individuals can experience dead ends and setbacks in trying to advance the field of medicine. Take, for example, the case of this gentleman. This is Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis. Back in the 1800s, he proposed this. He proposed that surgeons should wash their hands before doing surgeries so as to limit the spread of infections. So what's so strange about that? That sounds right. However, unfortunately in those days, not many believed that germs could actually cause disease. So Semmelweis was ridiculed by the medical establishment for his beliefs. And sadly, this caused him to go insane, and he ended up committed to a mental asylum where he died. And yes, nowadays we wash our hands even before eating dinner, and we understand that Semmelweis made a great contribution to mankind, but sadly, he was recognized only after his death. Or take the case of our national hero, Dr. Jose Rizal, who was a poet, a writer, a patriot, and also an eye surgeon, who accidentally blinded his mother, Doña Teodora. So how did this happen? Well, when I was in grade school, we went to Fort Santiago in Intramuros, and in the museum there, I saw a jar on the shelf which contained an eyeball. And I asked the tour guide, whose eyeball is that? And he said, that belongs to Rizal's mother, Doña Teodora. So how did this happen? Well, Doña Teodora had a cataract, and Rizal, who was very skilled in surgery after his training in Germany, performed a cataract surgery which was successful. However, an infection set in afterwards, and Rizal ended up having to remove the eye that he had operated on, and he was very regretful, saying now he understands that it's prohibited to operate on members of one's family because the results can be quite dire. Nowadays, if you make a discovery, it's hard to claim that you are the only person who came up with this idea, because most great discoveries are not the work of one person, but rather they are the result of people building on the contributions of other people who came before them, sometimes over the centuries. Take, for example, the germ theory of disease, the belief that many diseases are caused by germs. If we asked who's responsible for this, some people might say, well, it's Louis Pasteur or maybe Robert Koch in the 1800s who came up with these ideas. But if we'll be fair, we'll have to stretch back all the way to the time of the ancient Greeks and trace their contributions up through the Renaissance until we reach the time of Pasteur and Koch. So nobody can really say that one person was responsible, but that many contributed to this discovery. Okay, reason number 5. Studying history will allow us hindsight into some of the great misconceptions of the past and provide a mindset or framework to help us think about current or future challenges in medicine. So that means if you've been clinging to a particular medical treatment or tradition for the longest time, but new data emerges and says, hey, this treatment is no longer valid, then you have to abandon that practice. Makes sense, right? Just as in the past, these treatments were no longer practiced because the evidence showed otherwise. But what's going on in this drawing? Over here, you have a doctor transfusing blood from animal to man. But why do this? Well, it was believed in the olden days that a patient who suffered from anxiety or nerves would benefit if they received blood from an animal that has a docile, peaceful disposition. So blood from a lamb, a sheep, or a dog would benefit the human patient. Of course, we know this to be a very dangerous practice now. We don't do transfusions between species. If you have anxiety, the doctor will prescribe you Valium or some other sedative. What about bloodletting? For centuries, people believed that illness was caused by imbalance in the blood. And this makes some sense, but it was treated by draining the patient of blood. And we no longer do this because we have a different model for illness now. But do we abandon something like this? Look at this. Back in 2010, a study was done asking, should you still wear a face mask in the operating room? Is it still necessary? And we might say, yeah, of course, it's obvious. A face mask will prevent the spread of infection during a surgery. But strangely enough, the results showed that the face mask actually has no bearing on causing infection. So the study recommended that face masks be optional. It might even save money to not use face masks. That's why members of the surgical team here are not wearing face masks during the surgery. And other studies came out supporting this finding. But you may ask, so why are we still wearing face masks? Well, the doctors who do use face masks justify it by saying, well, we're doing this for the sake of the patient. The patient's family, the patient himself, they watch TV, they see doctors in TV wearing face masks during surgeries. So the public expects us to wear face masks as well. This is more for the benefit of the public. So what do you think? Well, a practice of wearing face masks during surgery, which has been around for more than 100 years, will this vanish too in time? Let's see. Okay, reason number 6. Studying the history of medicine adds richness and color to medical facts. Well, to be honest, while going over a typical medical textbook, richness and color are not the first adjectives that come to mind. But if we do look into many of the stories behind medical achievements and the people behind them, we will find a rich and interesting store of information. For example, do you ever ask why we wear surgical rubber gloves during surgeries? It was not always the case. Back in the day, surgeons would just wash their hands for 30 minutes or so, and then they would operate barehanded, no gloves. This was the standard of care for the longest time. But one day, Dr. William Halsted changed everything. And for maybe a selfish reason, he was in love with his scrub nurse, Carolyn Hampton, and he noticed that every time the nurse scrubs in, her hands would blister because of the very powerful detergent used in the surgical scrub. So, out of love for his scrub nurse, Halsted had a special pair of rubber gloves crafted just for her, not for himself. So, the nurse, Carolyn Hampton, was the first person to wear surgical gloves in the operating theater because of an allergy. Later on, the use of surgical gloves caught on because Halsted's team was now using surgical gloves, and Halsted was considered a pioneer and very influential, so other doctors and surgeons took up this practice. But if you look at the origins of the surgical glove, you might say it was created out of a love affair. Or what about the story of Louis Pasteur, the creator of so many vaccines that have saved countless lives? But did you know he had no medical license? So he had no right or authority to give vaccines to human beings. And if things had gone wrong, he would have ended up in jail rather than in the history books. And yes, maybe not all dreams are meant to be. Because you want to be a doctor with all your heart, does that mean you should be a doctor? Maybe God has another plan for your life. But if you are determined and persevere, here's the 7th reason why studying history of medicine will benefit you. On the dark and discouraging days, knowledge of medical history reminds us of our potential for progress, affirms that victories are possible, and restores our faith in humanity's ability to achieve beautiful and marvelous things. So, know that other people have come before you and that they went through similar struggles and have overcome them. If you're determined and you know that this is for you, then do your best. Don't let small minds convince you that your dreams are too big. Thank you for listening. This is Dr. Rafael Valenzuela.
Welcome to the great adventure of med school. Thanks for listening to my dad. God bless. Bye.